Hi, Keith. This is Tara Whitehead, obviously, because I'm sending you this video. So I did not get a chance to do a screen capture recording today because we had an activity that went 25 minutes where the students did a writing prompt, which I'm going to show you here in a second. And it slipped my mind when we got to the lecture part, but I had students write a scene on where a secret is revealed. And I just used that as a fun way for students to get to know each other and also just get to talk. Sorry, I'm just making sure my technology is working here. Get to talk to each other. And so the Zoom students went into breakout rooms and they read what they wrote. This also got me to get them aware of how they would tell a story where a character is thinking about their situation and how it relates to their relationship with other characters. So I had students just generally discuss the idea of how did you come up with the idea. I asked if it was autobiographical or if it came from something that they had experienced in their lifetimes, and that kind of tied into the Juno Diaz piece and the Amy Hempel piece of how much does an author put of their own experiences into each of those stories to construct, voice and character. We also talked about point of view, and these were the points I went over for point of view, that there are 3 categories of point of view, and that each one contributes something different to the reading experience, the significance of what happens in the story, the reliability of the narrator. For instance, first person, we talked about how in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, the character is being very reasonable in her language, but the content of what she's talking about gets increasingly insane, to where she's seeing women in the wallpaper, to where she's becoming paranoid, and she's having like a split personality issue. And so while the language itself, the voice and the style are rational, what we're reading is not. And then we have to ask ourselves, do I really believe this character and what's going on? Because the only point of view that I have is the I, the first person. We even discussed how it's possible that it's possible if we conclude at the end that she is somewhat insane, then we look back and say, how much of this is believable then? How are we even to believe that John is her husband, or that there even is a baby? So that's this idea of the unreliable narrator in that first person, where we're kind of prisoner to their perspective. The second person, you, we discussed with relation to Juno Diaz and the imperative of walking somebody through instructions on how to, complete an action. And in the case of that story with him, it's, to date somebody of a different ethnicity. We discussed how using the you while tied into a clear character of Junior, as he's mentioned in the story, that it gave us, belief in the credibility of the narrator, even though we were being put into that authentic situation with the you. So with that, we also, I defined the word satire, which is the use of humor, mainly exaggeration, parody, etc., to draw attention to human deficits and societal issues. So this story for us, as we discussed as a class, brought up the issue of someone trying to erase their own ethnicity so that they could present themselves in a certain way to, a partner. And not just his ethnicity, but his socioeconomic status. And we went through looking at the details of how he does that. But also at the same time, the generalizations made about the white girls, the brown girls, the black girls, and the halfie, and how that is also a stereotype or a generalization about a group. So, we're playing with all these different constructed identities in this story. And so, but anyway, the second person allowed us to enter into Junior's experience, but really enter in and be walked through his experience. And the third person narration has those 3 components of omniscient, all knowing about the character interiority, that means their thoughts, but also across time. An omniscient narrator can say 5 years before this happened and then tell us about that in the narration. Whereas a limited omniscient narrator or a narrator with limited omniscience can't access all of the characters' minds or all of time, past, present, and future. That doesn't mean only one character through that use of he, she, they pronouns, but just not all. So it could be all but one, and that's still limited omniscience. An objective is usually used for playwriting and screenwriting. There's no access to character thoughts, past and future. Everything is in the present, and it's mostly reliant on action and dialogue. And then so characterization is just a term that we're defining in class as how do we reveal character. Disclosure is one of those things, which the secret exercise revealed. But obviously dialogue, actions, but also how a character behaves in public, private, and in personal spheres. So the public sphere would be, your job, out in the public. Personal would be in your personal relationships, and private would be alone. And how does a character think when they're by themselves? How do they think when they're in a small, intimate group? And how do they think when they're in public? And how do those things contrast? That usually creates a lot of conflict, especially in terms of identity for characters. We see that with Junior in the short story, How to Date a Brown Girl, Black Girl, White Girl, or Halfie. Sorry, I was thinking of the collection title as Drown, and I almost said Drown. We also noted that story is from the New Yorker, and that the New Yorker is a genre of story that evolves over time, and we'll talk about it later in the semester. But next class we do have George Saunders' Victory Lap, and that's a New Yorker story as well, and it's very, very different. But the New Yorker is usually considered the I have arrived venue for writers, because it is it has traditionally been seen as the most prestigious place for fiction and poetry to be published, but for a wide audience, I guess I should say too. So in addition to characterization, we discussed voice, and voice is this compilation of all the things the author has stylized and how they decide to use their words, to what level of detail do they want to use. In Amy Hempel's In the Cemetery Where Al Jolson's Buried, the details she chooses to incorporate are not a lot of setting details. It's not backstory about the characters. We don't even get the characters' names. We just get their behaviors and their interactions with each other. And they're sort of volleying back and forth with this dialogue. So she decides to, create this dialogue of characters who, the dialogue carries the relationship without addressing the issue in the room, which is that the friend is dying. So, and that obviously has to do with fear. So it shows there's a lot of fear in the relationship. But we also looked at motifs. We didn't get to talk too much in depth about those because we'll be discussing them next class. But with the motifs, it's the recurring images. And at the end of class, a couple of people had addressed that, earthquakes were a recurring image. The chimp, these factoids, these stories were recurring images, and the fear of flying. So what do those things mean? Why are they significant? We don't know what happens to the narrator. She never outright says that the friend dies, but we kind of deduce that by her saying, who's to say if I was there or not? But, this story then becomes not about the person who is dying. It becomes about the person who is witnessing the dying and who is still alive, and that fear and that grief that they go through of loss, but also their own sense of mortality. And so we see that this narrator is trenchantly aware of her own mortality. And so, she takes it the fear of flying class, and her greatest fear is that she's going to finish the class and still be afraid. But that, we make these decisions, a lot of decisions in our life based off of fear. And so anyway, those are the things that we covered in class. In addition to satire, we defined diegesis, Diegesis. And diegesis is the world of the characters, everything they can hear and smell, even the narration for us as we read if it's in third person. Non-diegetic elements would be things that contribute to the experience of reading that can't be sensed by the characters or narrators. So it would be, the line breaks on the page, if there's a big white spot in the page, if there's, outside things that are stylized specifically for the reader, that would be non-diegetic. But the most important thing to know is that diegesis is the world of the characters, everything from setting, character, setting and character and actions, plot, all of those things. So that's a summary of what our class was today, and please let me know if you have any questions.